Hey gang. So before I even get started, I'm just curious, how many people have ever heard of the netdev library? There's a few people. All right, well that makes me feel a little better. Before I even get any slides and all this, just a real quick introduction of myself. My name is Peter Sbrigata, and although I do work at Arista Networks, I promise this isn't going to be a 45-minute discussion on networking and CLI and telnet and SSH, because that would pretty much bore everyone in this room, myself included. But what I do want to talk about is what we've got. There's a lot of activity that's been going on in the Puppet world in terms of being able to start to embrace things beyond just compute and applications and virtualization, right? Specifically looking at how can we start to extend Puppet to handle things like network devices and storage devices and whatnot. And so I'm going to take you through that a little bit and also share with you as I kind of go through this, some of the unique challenges that we face from the networking side of things, and maybe how we can start to address some of that and start to really bring the network into this bigger fold of being what I call a first-class citizen, in the Puppet ecosystem. So I guess to kind of get started, why did we do netdev? And I should mention that everything I'm talking about is specific to netdev. This has nothing to do with necessarily the company I come from. This is actually something that's supported across all networking vendors. But why? Well, it was really all about operational agility. I'm sure there's a number of folks in here who can relate to having to make that dreaded phone call to the networking team because you want a port provisioned, a VLAN turned up, or an access list opened, and knowing that it's going to be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks before that happens when you just turned up 5 systems in a matter of lunch. So we needed to move in this direction. I think that Deepak hit it perfect. We talked about shadow IT and the fact that you start to find ways around this. Well, instead of finding ways around the network, we want to try and start to give you some tools that you can just integrate with the network and make some of this a little bit easier. The other big reason why we wanted to kind of go down this path is this idea that the number one reason for network outages, which most people probably know, is configuration issues. And network's no different than any other IT resource. It's a lot of why we're all here today and why utilizing a tool like Puppet makes so much sense. But we really want to try and solve some of those problems and produce a set of modules that not only work with the network, but really can be utilized ubiquitously across the entire IT data center. So a little bit of history. NetDev standard lib has actually been around for going on almost a year and a half now. It's been available on the Forge. It was originally started as a community project. There was 3 individuals that really kind of focused on trying to bring this idea to life. It was originally pioneered by a gentleman by the name of Jeremy Schulman when he was at Juniper Networks. And then it was carried on by myself, as we started to move it forward. But we learned very, very quickly that while it was a great community project, it didn't get a lot of real pickup because there just wasn't a lot of systems teams that were really able to bridge this gap between having the native constructs to start to manage Puppet and being able to engage with the network teams and understand how this all kind of comes together. So, one of the things that we did very early on when we built the NetDev standard lib is we wanted to make sure that it was vendor neutral. And this is something that's been kind of the underlying tone through everything we've done. So the entire NetDev library is really focused on whether you'll have network devices from Cisco or Juniper or Arista or Cumulus or right on through the list. The NetDev library, as long as we have the appropriate providers written, should work, and in fact does in many, many cases. One of the unique things about NetDev, and I think it's one of the things that really talks to the power of kind of the architecture of really what Puppet is all about, is really in its implementation. So the NetDev standard lib was really designed to allow us to abstract the types and the providers separately. The NetDev standard lib types are what we initially had released to the community and started to try and focus on provisioning things like access ports and VLANs and all the kind of stuff that I had referenced very early on. And then each vendor could write their own provider and implement it on a specific node-by-node basis. So this is what really kind of brought this idea to life of the fact that we can now define a VLAN as a VLAN, or we can define a port as a port, and not get into the nuances of what the networking device is. Right? From a Puppet standpoint, this is fairly common stuff from the systems world, but so the networking world, this is like, whoa, cool. We've never had any tools like this, but the idea was how can we really start to bring this though into more of the mainstream? And in order to do so, we approached Puppet Labs about a year or so ago and sat down with them and kind of brought up the idea of, what if you guys took over the type library, the abstractions, and leave kind of the provider implementation up to the various vendors that wanted to support those abstractions. And after some good back and forth, we finally convinced it was the right thing to do. And since then, we've been working very closely with the software engineering team at Puppet to make this reality. I can tell you, as of 2 weeks ago, we launched version 1.0 of netdev. It's available now on the Forge, and providers are starting to trickle in now from the various vendors. And it was important that Puppet got behind this because it really shows their commitment to extending beyond just the systems and applications world. And it really shows that they indeed are committed to really driving change and orchestration and automation across all facets of IT, not just simply compute and application and virtualization. So, as of release 1.0, the list, I won't go through the whole list, but the list of initial types that we've released, and this is only a very, very, this is very much just a start. We have a fairly significant set of types in the works, and we're going to continue to develop types and start to pick up more and more of those types, as we move forward. But we wanted to kind of seed something out there initially, and really what we wanted to kind of go after was this idea of that let's focus on system level services and not get let's not get too deep into this, at least initially. Keep complexity low and kind of get the feet wet, and hopefully provide an opportunity to start the discussions with those networking teams so that we can start to have real discussions about how we orchestrate IT, whether it's whether you're running in the cloud, you're running it in your own data center, you're running it across a legacy enterprise type implementation. Excuse me. We wanted to do this, and it was very important that we didn't take the traditional networking approach to this. And what I mean by that is we didn't want to just dump this in and say, okay, we're the networking company, and we're going to come over and tell you how to do everything, because that's kind of the area the networking teams the networking vendors have struggled in the past. To really provide tools that are useful to the community. So we really kind of focused on building netdev in a way that made sense, and it kind of integrated with the best practices of the Puppet ecosystems that were out there. So things, just very simple things, like making all the source code available on GitHub so that you can contribute, you can open issues against, you can file bugs, you can even send pull requests, and we're always happy to accept them, whether it's on the abstraction side or the provider side. But making sure that all the stable code got pushed up to Puppet Forge, and it's well tested, it's well documented, provides good system level as well as unit level testing, of these modules. And these were all absolute requisites as we put this together. But as we kind of started to really build netdev and look at, how can we start to implement it, we kind of ran into some issues, and a lot of it focused on, really just not so much from a technology standpoint, but how can we get folks talking in a more communal language, right? The folks that are running, Puppet systems and building a lot of the modules today really had no idea, kind of what the networking world is about. When I ask systems guys about, their experience with the network, they're like, oh, I don't know, it's this thing over here, right? That things go in, things go out, and I have no idea what happens. And, the problem is on the networking side, you got the same problem. You talk to the network guys and you say, well, explain to me how this application works or how that system flow works. Like, I don't know. All I know is I got to connect here to there and I'm done, right? So, a lot of this is not just giving, building the types and making them available, but it's also to start to hopefully, have the discussions, between the various teams and really build up, kind of that DevOps type culture to include the network. So here's kind of a starting point. This is actually a config off of it's actually a templated config off of a switch. And, Imagine for a minute, if you will. Imagine, for those of you who manage applications and manage systems, imagine if you were given one comp file. And that one comp file had to have every setting for your system, your application, all your services, everything that ran on that system. That's what the network guys have been dealing with for the last 20 years. And we've had to try and figure out how you're going to automate this. Yikes. It wasn't going to happen. So that's really what drove a lot of the need for netdev, and hopefully we can start now the conversation now that we've got some basic types to work with. We can actually start it. We can start looking at things like this, right? And instead of dealing with those great big, obscure config files, we can actually start to build, and model our network configuration in something like Hire or whatever your favorite backend system is. We can start to implement consistency and control, and this is a lot of what netdev is trying to bring to the table, and hopefully what you can start to use in your organizations. Once we started to kind of build out our backend, now we can start to actually implement a lot of the classes and wrap around what netdev is providing from a native construct standpoint, and start to build a lot of the orchestration components and the automation components and the configuration components that we can actually start to implement this across vendor implementations. However, it doesn't just stop there. A lot of what we did with netdev applies even in the systems world as well, right? Bottom line is a VLAN is a VLAN. An interface is an interface, an IP interface is an IP interface. I don't care if it's a Linux server or it's a network device. We just happen to have a whole lot more of those things. But nonetheless, right, we can start to use the same netdev constructs to actually orchestrate those types of environments. So now we can start to talk about these resources and holistically implement them across the infrastructure, whether it's the server, whether it's the application that needs it, or whether it's the network that needs it. So once we get all this done, of course, right, then we just go off and we automate. Now, contrary to popular belief, this is not done with Telnet or SSH or any other interactive terminal type utility, nor is it done with God help me, Tickle or Perl or any of those. This is actually stuff that's running natively on these boxes. And so the point here being is that you can start to manage the network infrastructure the same way you're managing any other device in your public ecosystem. As a matter of fact, so much so that when you start to actually work with the netdev standard lib, it should feel like any other system in your puppet environment. If you're finding you're jumping through a lot of hoops to do simple things, something isn't right there. And we need to get it fixed. But the reality is it should act like anything else in the infrastructure. So I work for a networking vendor, right? And vendors are always supposed to bring T-shirts. Well, I work on the coding side. This is as close as I get to bringing T-shirts. But how do we really take this to the next phase? And I think this is really the crux of where we need to go with netdev. And this is kind of my challenge to everyone here. First, it's all about starting the conversation, right? And trying to open up the lines of communication between the networking teams and the automation teams and the systems teams and the DevOps teams, and not just simply continue to keep that walled infrastructure in place. The question is, how do we start to do that? How do we start those conversations? Well, there's a school of thought out there that says, well, take all the networking operations guys and turn them into developers. And I've heard this one a lot. And quite frankly, that just doesn't work. Network guys are expertise in very specific domain, that is networking. Much like I talk to systems folks and I tell them, you can automate, big, multi-compute node type applications, whether it's an application running on Oracle or SAS or SAP or whatever it may be, right? It doesn't mean you're experts in those applications, but you can still automate in those environments. The same thing true comes on the network side of things, right? You can start to look at the network as a series of applications that are running. We can start to manage them as such. Our applications have different names, right, as anyone would, right? Spanning tree and MLang and VRRP and OSPF, but at the end of the day, they're just applications. That's all they are. So the idea here is that we can start to get over this idea that, it's just that box in the corner, and we can start to have a discussion at an application layer. And once we start to talk at an application layer, right, and we start to talk about parameters and properties and state, we can actually start to have the real discussion about how we can take that massive configuration and bring it now down into constructible blocks, right? Things that we can absorb, things that we can actually start to affect change with. And that's how we can start to actually implement these types of that's how we can actually start to utilize Puppet to start to implement automation around the network. An interesting thing happens when we start to do that. And experience has told us, after doing this on a number of different occasions, that patterns start to emerge. No different than package file service, right? Patterns on the network start to emerge at an application layer. It allows us to have a communication about these patterns and actually start to talk in patterns now. Now we all know that when we can start to bring things into an object, into a model, and start to reference them in terms of patterns, right? Now all of a sudden the automation side becomes a whole lot easier. Because we've got a common language now we can start to talk about. And that's what we're trying to do with NetDev and where we're trying to go with it. In fact, to your network guys, I would say to them, for any of you who have responsibility for the network, in reality, it's no different than what you're already doing today on your network devices. Your network CLI is really just kind of like a DSL. It's just a very specific DSL. If you're running that particular box, right? We just hide it under this big guise called CLI. But if we can start to break that apart a little bit, we can start to talk in terms of individual pieces and parts and applications and building blocks. We can start to look at how we start to integrate. One of the things I tend to tell folks a lot is that automation is meant to be consumable in bite-sized chunks, and you get to define what your bite-sized chunk is. In the networking world, right, we can start to do that because we can start to look at this as a referenceable implementation utilizing these types of constructs. So we can start to actually build automation in layers. We don't have to automate everything from day one, as you guys well know, right? We don't have to flip the light switch and go from used to be everyone typed in commands to now all of a sudden everything is automated. And kind of the way we start is we really kind of start with looking at those system level services, those things that really don't impact how data moves across the network infrastructure, but yet are imperative to keep the system up and running, right? We all know what they are. Right? Things like syslog and NTP and SNMP and all of those types of tools that are required to actually keep the system up and running and be able to report on its ability to do its job. One of the stories I love to tell people about is I actually had an implementation that I know about, and it was the easiest job in the world I ever had to convince someone to deploy Puppet. In this particular implementation, the systems guys had swapped out a bunch of the syslog servers and renumbered them. Didn't think it was a big deal. And of course, the network team never got the memo, and so all the syslog was pointing at the old IPs that were no longer there. Well, sure enough, right? Along comes a big outage, and the executive team wants answers as to what happened and why. And network team goes to pull syslogs, and lo and behold, there's nothing there. And that was a really difficult discussion to have. Because they basically had to go to their manager and say, I don't know, couldn't tell you what happened. I've got no logging, I got no visibility, right? And it was after that outage that we sat down, we had a discussion about Puppet, and within about 6 weeks, we actually had Puppet deployed in their infrastructure, managing syslog with netdev. But the point is that these are the types of use cases that we can really start to engage in, and we can not find ourselves in those types of situations anymore. So hopefully, by the end of this, you start to engage with your networking teams, and the networking teams will realize that the value add that we bring when we start talking about automation with Puppet, and we start talking about utilizing things like NetDev, it's really going to start to make their lives a whole lot easier. Because they're going to be able to go back to focus on being a network engineer, not focus on things like, well, I got to get that VLAN provision for those systems guys because they just won't leave me alone, or I got to get that access list or that interface turned up. And we can start to do so in a much shorter time frame instead of waiting the 2 and 3 and 4 weeks that ultimately it takes, to get these networking, these networking configuration changes rolled out. So kind of, I like to throw out this idea of this call to action. And the first step we kind of made, right? We've got netdev out there. It's available, and I encourage everyone to grab it and start playing with it and seeing what you can do with it. And start those conversations with your networking teams. And start talking about how we can now start to orchestrate applications and workflows that span the entire, IT implementation, or the IT ecosystem. Right? We no longer have to resign ourselves to just systems or just applications. We can start looking at not only provisioning applications, but also provisioning the necessary resources from the network underneath it. And get out of the business of having to wait on that networking team or even worse, having to figure out how to bypass the networking team in order to get change implemented. However, we've really only started the work here. As I said, release 1.0 is out there, and we released it about 2 weeks ago, but it's really just the beginning. But where we go with it really depends on folks, everyone in this room, right? And I'm having, I'm out talking with all of the public communities and encouraging folks to get involved with this, because it's how we'll actually affect real change, in our ability to automate the network, and where we want to go with it. So, we're looking at different aspects of what do we start to support next. We've got a lot of access level stuff now solved. VLANs and interfaces and radius and TACAX and SNMP. But where do we go next with it? And really the answer lies in the community, and that's what we're looking to for help and support. We can all sit up here and come up with ideas and throw more code out there, but we want to make sure it makes sense and it's the right thing to do. We also want to make sure that as we continue to put this together, we're putting it together that's giving you the building blocks that you need. So, a lot of what netdev is today is really just, like I said, it's the native constructs, it's the types of providers, right? We're not getting into the business of writing classes and module implementations, because that really, would start to indicate how you want to ultimately use these things in your workflow. And we're trying to give you, the tools necessary to make this a reality. So, I encourage you to get involved. Certainly using the code, filing bugs, generating pull requests, opening, trouble tickets, whatever the case is. Reach out to your network guys, find out what networking devices you have, and start to go down the path of automating with Puppet. The netdev standard lib is available, at the URL here, and go grab it, take a look at it. It should feel, as you start to get into it, it should feel very familiar to you. It should not have a network feel to it at all. And if it does, we really missed the boat on what we were trying to do. So I don't want to just necessarily leave you though with a bunch of slides that talk about what netdev is. And as I promised, it was released 2 weeks ago. So I want to take a moment and just kind of show you some of this, and we can talk through kind of what it is that we're doing. Bear with me here. Hopefully this works. We'll see how it goes. Yeah. So, maybe not. Hey, there we go. So we can actually see that. Hopefully you can see that in the back, okay. But, as I mentioned, right, being able, and that's really tough to see, isn't it? Let's try. Okay. So, what we really want to do is we really want to start talking about, like I said, we really want to start talking about the network in terms of things that make sense to us in the Puppet world. So if I just look at looking at pirate data, you can see that in a lot of cases here, we're just describing things that have nothing to do with the network per se in terms of how it's actually implemented. And this now becomes true whether it's Cisco in your network, or Juniper in your network, or Arista in your network, or right on through the list. Or you want to start to manage a lot of your Linux networking components this way. And we can start to do that very easily with what netdev provides. So we can manage things like VLANs and interfaces, port channels and SNMP all become very easy to start to implement. On the actual network device itself, though, right? If anyone's ever logged into a network device, of course you know that it has this whole auspicious around CLI implementation, and it's got all this funny verbiage and weird things that it does. But in reality, we can actually start to manage things just like you can with, well, maybe. I think I just lost my connection. Bear with me just a second. Okay, well, so much for the demo. My connection to my wireless connection is not going to work. I was actually attaching to a remote system. The slides come back up for just a moment. So, at the end of the day, if my system doesn't break, my goal is to make Luke lose $5. So I don't know how many of you saw this tweet he posted. This came out in September of last year. And so I grabbed a copy of it just to kind of throw up here. And the idea behind this is, right, that we no longer have to wait to start to automate around the network. We no longer have to pretend like it's this nebulous of a system out there that we can no longer send or that we can no longer interact with at a automation layer or a programmable layer, and that we can actually start to integrate it into our workflows. We can start to describe things in terms of objects with properties and parameters, and we can start to build those things utilizing netdev standard lib and start to integrate them into our Puppet runs. And we can start to do this in a way that makes working with any networking device no different than working with any other system or any other application in our infrastructure. And that we can continue to push this forward in such a way that as we add new feature functionality and as that comes out of the abstractions in netdev, we can implement those and start to really take advantage of how we do multi-system orchestration across the network infrastructure. And I think that is the end of my slides. I'm going to try and pull my demo back up for just a minute, but while I'm doing that, is there any specific questions I can answer?
Yeah, how do you maintain the convergence between the bits that this is configured and the bits that this can't yet configure? Because you can't put part of a config on a new device, but replace the device or whatever.
Yeah, so what we're doing in netdev is very similar. We've got essentially something that would be analogous to the exec command that allows us to basically just raw push commands into a box. Now, that comes with a caveat that that's not an idempotent operation, right? And that has to be understood as we start to build and get more pieces defined. But we do have that same construct available in netdev standard lib that allows us to do so and actually start to push more configuration out to the box. Try the old hotspot trick and see if we can get it in. Oops. Alright, let's see if we can get in and actually show you some of this in operation. It's never good when you base your entire presentation around a remote system and then all of a sudden you can't get to that remote system anymore. It is ironic that the one networking guy up here is the one that's having trouble with the network. It's just not happening at all. Okay. What's that? Yeah, the wireless connection is just really struggling. Try one more time. And then,
So maybe we all disconnect. And wish really hard.
That's right. Give it one more shot here, and if this doesn't work, then I'll just close it up and I'll go submit my resignation to my networking company. There we go. All right, we're getting in now. Okay. Yay. All right. So what I wanted to kind of share with you is this idea that Puppet doesn't have to be difficult when it comes to networking devices. In fact, it can look just like it can in any other networking implementation. So I'm a lazy typer, so I've just created an alias, and I wanted to show you that before I actually executed it. My two aliases are the Puppet agent and Puppet resource. These should look very familiar to you. These are just the straight commands. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to run Puppet agent, and it's actually going to run that Hyra backend for me. It's actually going to configure state on the device. Now, when this runs, oh boy. This is why you don't let a network guy do a Puppet demo. No. V. Now we'll get to see something. So you're going to see that. I mean, now it's anticlimactic at this point, right? But the point being is that you can actually see that the Puppet runs are exactly like they would be on any other device. In so much so that I can actually manage resources in the exact same manner. So I can do things like look at. Make sure I type this right. Talking and typing is not a skill I've ever mastered. So I can do things like look at my resource interaction layer using Puppet resource or PR in my lazy typing world. And I can actually start to see these things in real time. And I can start to work with them much like I can with any other Puppet resource. The difference is I'm just doing it on a network box now. What makes this interesting is that for those of you who already have Puppet knowledge, right, all of a sudden you can actually start to administer networking devices. Why? Because you know how to utilize the Puppet abstraction layer to actually affect change on the box. And in doing so, we can actually start to configure the box in the exact same way. So I can do something very simply as a Puppet resource, say network underscore VLAN, I don't know, 600, ensure equal present, and it'll go ahead and create VLAN 600 on the box for me. And then I can use traditional network shell commands if I wanted to, and still validate that things are working. Just as easily, I can, of course, learn how to type. I can remove a VLAN if I will, and again, now I can see the VLAN is gone. So the point here being is that with netdev, don't be afraid of it from the aspect that it doesn't bring, this whole networking world, crashing down on your head. If anything else, it's the other way around. And it gives you an opportunity now to start to engage with your networking teams and actually start to build, a lot of your missing pieces in terms of how you want to orchestrate systems and orchestrate flows, across your IT infrastructure. So with that, I will bear us from doing any more of the demo because it may drop again, but I will take any questions, that you may have. Yeah?
State of integrating this with SD controllers like Cisco's ACI or OpenFlow.
So I'm going to address them in reverse order. So from the OpenFlow perspective, there really isn't necessarily a natural integration between Puppet and the network device. Where Puppet would take advantage of that would be orchestrating automation of the SDN controller itself. Yeah. So we're not trying to solve that problem with netdev. We're trying to stay focused on the networking device itself, in this particular case.
Where, if anything, in Puppet is going to introduce ties into controllers?
I'm not. I have not seen anyone start to go down that path as of yet. As far as ACI integration goes, there is no, and again, I have to always, disclaimer, I work for a Cisco competitor. But to my knowledge, there is no work going on in the community to integrate ACI with Puppet. However, Cisco is working very hard to integrate the netdev providers and is in full support of doing this as we move forward. Okay. Yep.
So how many networking providers are behind?
As of right now, there are 6 vendors that have committed support for netdev. Of those 6, there are 2 released today. And the other ones that are coming, I know that there are 2 coming in the next roughly 30 to 60 days. So probably by midsummer we should have them all out and available, from the porch. Okay.
Any other questions? Peter? Awesome, thank you, Peter.